It's a privilege today to have Dr. Michael Bird. Dr. Michael Bird is at, I hope I pronounced this right, but Ridley College in Melbourne, Australia. And he is a senior lecturer there. He is an academic dean at the college, and he's, as his bio describes, a very industrious researcher. Well, it says with editing over 30 books, but I think it's a lot more. If you have a look just on the internet, the contribution of Dr. Bird, his book on evangelical theology, the gospel of our Lord, Jesus and the origins of the Gentile mission, his writings on Paul, what every Christian should believe. Absolutely brilliant books. Also commentaries on Romans and Philemon. There is so much to get into, but today especially we're going to look at Jesus the Eternal Son, answering adoptionist Christology. Dr. Bird is engaging with quite a wide trend of individual scholars like Barty Erdman, Jennifer Knust, Dale B. Martin, even Dr. Larry Hurtado, Simon Gattercole. And this debate is concerning what early Christians believed about Jesus. And this is a very important discussion because of the influence of those scholars right there in South Africa. And so you're really going to enjoy this. I'm really looking forward to this. Dr. Bird, I'm going to put off my video, but you are welcome. Please speak freely. Enjoy your conversation. Be blessed. And I'm going to hand over to you, and you are welcome to start. If you need me, I'll be in the background, so I'll always be lurking, but I don't want to distract you with my video. You're welcome, Dr. Bird.
Let me start off by saying how I wrote that book on Jesus the Eternal Son. I was walking around the Society of Biblical Literature, which was, a big conference they have in America every year. We get all sorts of Bible interested people from around the world get together. And I saw a big poster for Bart Ehrman's new book. Now, Bart Ehrman is a scholar of early Christianity. He once identified as a Christian, but he's kind of moved into being what he calls a happy agnostic. And he kind of likes to write one book after another, sort of debunking some aspect of Christianity. And they're always entertaining, often informative, but they've also got a little bit of a particular polemical edge to them. And this new book was called How Jesus Became God. And the moment I saw it, my heart sank, because I knew as soon as the book came out, I was going to be receiving all sorts of emails from former students, from friends, Christians around the world, kind of like, oh, well, I've been talking to people who've been reading this book and I don't know what to make of it. I mean, some of it sounds all right. And, my heart instantly kind of sank because I knew my email box was going to get filled up. And actually that did happen. But to do a little bit of a preemptive response, I thought I would write my own response to the book, and working with a publisher and some colleagues like Simon Gathercole, Chris Tilling, Craig Evans, and a few others, we decided to come up with our own response to Bart Ehrman's book, and we're able to do that thanks to the generosity of Bart and his publisher at the same time. So Bart's book was How Jesus Became God, and we did our own little book called How God Became Jesus. And I focused on several aspects in that book, in my contributions. But the one thing I probably wish I had accented more than anything else was how did adoptionist Christology arise? Now, adoption Christology is the view that Jesus was not always divine. He becomes divine, either at his resurrection or at his baptism at some point. So it's a kind of human being who becomes a divine figure. So that was a very big piece of Bart Ehrman's view of early Christianity. And so I had to write a subsequent book called Jesus the Eternal Son, where I kind of teased out some of that. Now, let me say where I think Bart Ehrman is right. And this is where he actually changed his views. He doesn't see early Christianity changing from, well, initially Jesus is a prophet, and then he becomes slightly divine, and then he becomes fully divine. He recognized that the early church believed Jesus was divine from the get-go. And he's right to ask this, in what sense was Jesus divine? And there he tries to point out there's probably a few different models operating concurrently. And one of those models, he thinks, is an early exaltationist Christology, where Jesus is exalted or adopted to divine status and divine honors, and eventually you get an incarnational Christology, and then later on you get all sort of docetic or Gnostic Christologies, all these other sort of derivative movements as well. And I wanted to tackle that issue of when and where did adoptionist Christology first arise, as far as we know. Now, it may have emerged very early. It may have emerged from different people thinking that that's a way to understand how Jesus is divine. So I wouldn't deny that maybe it was out there. But the standard sources used to map the emergence of adoptionist Christology, I just don't think say that. And I would say the only group who I think is 100% adoptionist in their Christology is the Theodosians, who appear at the end of the 2nd century. So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm trying to argue, because one line of scholarship, and this is where Bart Ehrman is a little bit into this, argues that one of the earliest views of Jesus as divine was an adoptionist, or Ehrman calls it an exaltationist Christology. And in adoptionism, there is a time when Jesus was not the Son of God. Divine sonship is something that he acquires, either at his resurrection or maybe at his baptism. And which would be ironic in some ways, because as James Dunn points out, certain adoptionist groups, which he identifies the Ebionites as holding, were rejected for being adoptionist, and yet Dunn said that was ironic, because that heretical Jewish Christianity of the 2nd century would appear to be not so very different from the faith of the first Jewish believers. In other words, James Dunn, who sadly died some months ago, he argued that adoptionist Christology was very probably one of the earliest responses trying to figure out who Jesus is. So rather than have someone say in the beginning was the Word and the Word was with God, some might argue that in the beginning was a man who was adopted as God's Son at his baptism or his resurrection. Now, again, as I've said, there may well have been people out there who believed that Jesus was divine in a kind of adoptionist sense. You've got to remember, 10 minutes after Pentecost, I don't think all the first Christians were walking around with the Nicene Creed or the Westminster Confession downloaded into their head. And there may well have been different attempts to say, well, who is Jesus? How does he relate to God the Father? In what sense he was divine? But the standard texts used from the early church to allege that there was an operative adoptionist Christology, I just don't think suggests that. Let me go through some of them now. One of the texts used to suggest that the early church had an adoptionist Christology is Romans chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. Let me read this to you according to the NRSV. This is where Paul gives a short gospel formula about the gospel concerning his Son, who is descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness, by resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, this short sort of summary, the short little almost like tweet of the gospel, is a kind of maybe a primitive creedal formula or a confessional formula that Paul has incorporated in his letter to the Romans. It seems to have some of the signs or the telltale signs of being a bit of primitive material or traditional material from wherever that Paul has incorporated into this letter to accent that he's got the same gospel as the Romans. Now, what Ehrman says from this, he says this: from this creed, one can see that Jesus is not simply the human Messiah. He is not simply the Son of Almighty God. He is both things in two phases. First, he is the Davidic Messiah predicted in Scripture. And second, he is the exalted divine Son. So Ehrman and others see kind of a two-stage Christology. Initially, Jesus is the Son of David, and then at his resurrection, he becomes the Son of God in power, which would be indicative of a kind of adoptionist or an exaltation Christology. He only really becomes the divine almighty in power Son action. Now, there's a few things I have to say in response to that. The first one is resurrection does not make you a divine son. For a start, son of God in the Jewish world does not mean a human person who's been exalted or adopted to divine status. Son of God could be a way of talking about the angels. It could be a way of talking about the king, or maybe in a sense, someone who's got a unique relationship with God. It's not a post-mortem state that you necessarily aspire to. There were numerous figures who were assumed into heaven in the Old Testament, like Enoch or Elijah. And then you've got like the two witnesses in Revelation who die and come back to life. Or even John the Baptist was thought to have died and come back to life. But no one said that they were a son of God. So dying and coming back to life does not make you a son of God. Some people appeal to the Roman imperial cult, where there was a kind of a tradition where if their emperor was good and well regarded, when he died, he was regarded as experiencing apotheosis, and he would become a god. He would maybe change into an astral entity. They'd see a comet or a star and say, there you go, Julius Caesar is now seated in the immortal and divine realm, or something along those lines. The problem with that is the Son of God language was not applied to the divinized or deified emperor. Of the God was actually the adopted heir of the emperor. So was regarded as experiencing apotheosis, deification. It was not Julius Caesar, it was his adopted son Augustus, who was then regarded as being a son of God, because Augustus would then be the son of the divine Julius. So even a Roman emperor doesn't become a son of God by apotheosis or deification. It becomes an honorific title for one who is the son of the divinized emperor. The second thing I would want to stress is that the titles Son of David and Son of God were both designations for Israel's Messiah. So if you look at Romans 1:3-4, you see how it starts off with Jesus being a son of a descendant from David, in effect a son of David according to the flesh, and then the Son of God in power. These are both messianic titles rooted in the Old Testament and Second Temple literature. Think of passages like 2 Samuel 7 or Psalm 89, where the Davidic king is called a son of God, and the Davidic son was maybe ritually celebrated in the coronations that you find in Psalm 2 and Psalm 72. And you can find similar language in places like the Psalms of Solomon and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But here's the thing I want to stress. If the Son of David is a son of God, these two terms are roughly equivalent, then we cannot say that divine sonship begins at a point of resurrection. That is because in this little creed we have in Romans 1:3-4, divine sonship is already implied and activated by the reference to Jesus being a son of David. I mean, the Son of David is the Son of God, okay, because David's son was always going to be a son of God. That's what 2 Samuel 7 is all about. What we have in Romans 1:3-4 is not the shift from being a human Davidite to a divine son of God. What we have rather is a change from being one type of divine son, a Davidic type, to another type of divine son, altered version. The resurrection, if you like, enhances or upgrades divine sonship, or brings it to an eschatological expression, in that Jesus now more fully shares in divine executive power and majesty by virtue of his resurrection and exaltation. But it is not the beginning of divine sonship. Now, if I want to add a third point to that, Ehrman's view and a few other people's is contingent on the idea that that little phrase "in power" is an addition by Paul into a pre-existing creed. That would kind of accent the kind of mileage that Ehrman and others are trying to get out of it. But like many others, I don't see any reason for treating that phrase "in power" as a Pauline addition. So let me sum up my comments about Romans 1:3-4. Being raised to life does not make you a son of God. There is no logical link between resurrection and son of God, because we know of other figures from antiquity who are brought back to life, but they're never called a son of God. There is a two-stage movement in this little creed, but it's not from human Davidite to divine son. It's one type of divine sonship to another type of divine sonship. In other words, divine sonship is transposed or transformed rather than triggered by resurrection. So let me say that again. Divine sonship is transformed but not triggered by the event of resurrection. And if the Adoptionist reading requires regarding in power as a Pauline addition, I think that would be a fairly weak basis to support it on. So that's one of the key texts used to argue that this primitive tradition represents a primitive Christology of adoptionism. I don't see it there. The next text, the next favorite one to argue for adoptionist Christology in the New Testament is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 9-11, particularly the scene of Jesus's baptism. And there we read in Mark's Gospel, and it happened in those days that Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee came and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And immediately, as Jesus was rising up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven and said, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." Now, the Gospel of Mark is often regarded as being something of an innovation in the chronology of when and how Jesus became the Son of God. People try to argue that the tendency of the tradition was to push Jesus's sonship back earlier and earlier. So initially, Jesus's divine Son at the resurrection, then at his baptism in the Gospel of Mark, then at his birth, according to Matthew and Luke, and then in eternity past, according to the Gospel of John. So this is sort of evolution of divine sonship becoming earlier and earlier. I'm not too sure that's the case of what's happening here in Mark. The Gospel of Mark, so it goes, has no word on Jesus's pre-existence, no miraculous conception. So it's at his baptism that he becomes the Son of God, not merely declared or recognized. He literally gets adopted as the Son of God in the Jordan River. So if posed with the question, how is Mark's Jesus divine? Someone like Ehrman would answer, Jesus is divine in the sense that he is the one who has been adopted to be the Son of God at his baptism, not later at his resurrection. Now, I would say, on the one hand, it is possible to read the baptism story as a tale of adoptionism, okay, which is why people go to it. Particularly if you have a reader who's steeped maybe in the Roman imperial cult, knows about Roman adoption practices, and if you view this text, the baptism story on its own, divorced from the Old Testament in light of your own experience, I think there is a well possibility people may have understood it that way. One particular scholar, Michael Papard from New York, he's tried to argue that. He says, look, if you read the baptismal story in light of Roman practices of adoption and some of the symbolism, maybe the dove is a kind of a counterpart to the Roman eagle. He says it makes sense as a story of adoption. I think that's all well and possible, but you can only do that if you've got a special set of experiences and you dislocate it from what is the primary intertext, which I think is for Mark, the Old Testament, and particularly a number of Psalms. As well as that, I think within the course of Mark's Gospel, there's a lot more going on there that suggests that Jesus is far more than an adopted figure. But even granting that concession, I would still say this in response. If Jesus's adoption was a sort of reward for his virtuous life, as it was for later adoptionists, then one wonders why Mark has never mentioned this. What is it about Jesus that somehow merits his divine adoption as a kind of reward? Because we'll see later on that's exactly what people said about Jesus. I think it's better to say that Mark presents Jesus's baptism as the beginning of the gospel not the beginning of Jesus. Remember how Mark's gospel begins? It says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Christ. What I think is the best argument against Mark's an adoptionist reading of Mark's baptismal story is because the language of divine sonship gets repeated at least 2 more times in the rest of the gospel. If a voice of someone saying this is the Son marks a moment of adoption, then it would mean that Mark gets adopted no less than 3 times in his gospel. We have the baptismal scene where it says, you are my son, in whom I am well pleased. Then you've got the transfiguration story as well, you know, where all these sort of figures from the Old Testament, Elijah and Moses, they appear to Jesus. A voice from heaven says, this is my son, listen to him. And then you've got the scene at the crucifixion where a Roman centurion says, surely this was the Son of God. I mean, if I was going to pick a moment where Jesus finally got adopted, I actually probably would have picked the crucifixion scene. It would have been far more appropriate and far more ironic, given that it's confessed on the lips of a Roman centurion. So if a divine voice or any voice calling Jesus a son is tantamount to adoption, it would mean that Jesus gets adopted 3 times. Thirdly, the main reason I resist an adoptionist Christology is because I think Mark does have a divine Christology of sorts. And this is where I've got to point out. Some people think, okay, divine Christology means John's Christology, the Gospel of John. Mark's Gospel is not John, therefore it's not divine Christology. I think Mark's Christology is in a sense divine, but he's not doing it in a Johannine way, maybe not even in a Pauline way. I think he's doing it in his own way. We see evidence in the Gospel of Mark that he belongs to the heavenly council. He's associated with the angels in chapter 13. Even the demons seem to know that he is the Son of God. He transcends the heaven-earth divide. He has authority to judge. I think there are a few indications of pre-existence, and put it this way: when you get to chapter 2, you have that statement when Jesus forgives a lame person's sins, and the scribes say, "Well, who can forgive sins but God alone?" Now, I used to think that what was happening there was Jesus was acting like a rogue priest, because obviously the priests in the Jerusalem cultus, after you did a sacrifice, they would pronounce the forgiveness of sins. But I've had to change my mind on that because someone pointed out to me, I don't forget who it was, that nowhere in the Old Testament, when it comes to the sacrifices, nowhere in the practice of the cultus do we know does the priest ever mention the forgiveness of sins. It just kind of assumes it happens automatically. I think we've read Christian liturgy into that story, like, maybe you go to a church service where, we have the confession of sin and then you get the words of assurance. We just assume that the priest did the same thing back then, but there was no parallel. And that's why the scribes are really irritated or confused because, and they use monotheistic language, who can forgive sins but the one God. Okay, and Mark's gospel is filled with this language of there being one God. The other thing that I find is interesting is some of the nature miracles. Now, particularly Jesus walking on the water. Now, it depends which intertext you read these in light of, and there's a couple of different psalms you could use. But for the most part, Jesus seems to display theophanic qualities when he's walking on water, like Yahweh, who treads on the depths of the water ahead of you in the Exodus. Yeah, there's a couple of other different passages you might want to refer to that have maybe a slightly different nuance that wouldn't imply divinity, but I think there are clearly some that do. On the other hand, you get some texts in Mark's gospel, like where he's confronted with the question, what is the greatest commandment? And he gives a fairly standard, monotheistic answer. And yet at the same time, Jesus seems to quote Psalm 110 and include the Messiah within it. And then finally, you get Jesus's trial, where Caiaphas asks him, are you the son of the Blessed One? And Jesus's answer is affirmative, and he replies with a combination of Daniel 7:13 and Psalm 110. And those texts both refer to a figure enthroned beside Yahweh. In the case of Daniel 7, it's the one like a son of man. And in Psalm 110, it's this other sort of Davidic Lord. And we get the net effect of Jesus sharing in Yahweh's throne, not his own mini throne, but being exalted to the vice regency of Yahweh himself. And if you know anything about sort of ancient numismatics, if there's an emperor or a king, the crown prince will be often portrayed as sitting next to the king on the very same throne. So this is an image of co-regency. So if we look at the Gospel of Mark, if Mark intended to portray this as the adoption of Jesus to divinity or to divine sonship, then you'd expect some mention of his meritorious life, since that's exactly what most adoptionists mentioned as the basis for the adoption. If a voice that calls Jesus the Son implies his adoption, then Jesus gets adopted an amazing 3 times. And I think Mark's Christology does operate in divine coordinates, although people want to debate that a bit, and understandably why. But I do see enough hints there to say that Mark is a divine figure. In fact, one scholar, Eugene Boring, says this. He says, it is unmarkan to claim that Mark presents us with a human being, Jesus, who in the course of time is promoted to a higher ontological level, whether this be conceived as happening at his baptism or at his resurrection and exaltation. And I think Eugene Boring's right. He's got a very good article on this in the New Testament studies a few years ago. So if Jesus didn't get adopted at his in that pre-Pauline formula, or even in the Gospel of Mark, the group that most people turn to say, obviously they had an adoptionist Christology, was a group of Jewish Christians called the Ebionites. This is a Jewish Christian group known to several of the church fathers from the 2nd century. We don't have anything from themselves directly. We only hear from them secondhand, if you like. But for many people, they're frequently said, they just assumed that they were adoptionists. So Ehrman is one among many who says that there were a group of Christians living east of the Jordan who, he says, maintained that Jesus was a remarkable man chosen by God to be his son, adopted at his baptism. While not everything in that statement is false, it's certainly not the best way to describe the Ebionites either. We have to remember that Jewish authors were generally very allergic to the idea of a human being being deified. I mean, you see that very clearly in Philo, in his embassy about Gaius, where he really lets rip with a very strong critique of the Emperor Caligula and his pretensions to divinity. It's also there in Josephus. You can also get a lot of it, I think, in the Old Testament, in other Jewish literature. But our earliest source on the Ebionites is Irenaeus. And according to Irenaeus, the Ebionites did not have a adoptionist Christology. Rather, they seem to have possessed something that we would call a possession Christology, whereby the divine Christ comes into the man Jesus and makes him divine, but it's got nothing to do with divine sonship, nothing to do with a reward. What they're trying to do is keep a kind of gap between the human Jesus and the divine Christ. And then for some later groups, what would happen when Jesus was getting close to his crucifixion, the divine Christ would leave, so it was only the man Jesus who was being crucified. Even if we read something like the Gospel of the Ebionites, again, there's a few debates about where this document actually comes from. Is it really from them? Even when we read the scene of Jesus's baptism, and it gives a full quotation of Psalm 2, it still doesn't seem to have any explicit references to Jesus being adopted. There's some sort of other things that are there, like a great light that shines. But even the Gospel of the Ebionites don't seem to have a adoptionist Christology. So the one group that's regarded as the sure thing, the ones who definitely had an adoptionist Christology, the Ebionites, I don't think they had an adoptionist Christology, but it seems to be one of those things we keep recycling around that just gets assumed and repeated. If anything, they seem to have had a possession Christology or a separation Christology where there's the human Jesus and the divine Christ. So what is the first clear reference, the first full Monty bona fide adoptionist Christology advocates that we have solid evidence for? And the answer is it's probably a group called the Theodosians, based in Rome in the late 2nd century, probably around late 2nd century, like the 190s. There was one particular chap called Theodotus, who was a leather worker or cobbler, who came to Rome and developed a little bit of a following. According to Theodotus, Jesus was a mere man who was supremely virtuous. Thereafter, the Spirit or the Christ descended upon him, enabling him to do various miracles. Hippolytus, one of the church fathers, reports a diversity of views amongst the Theodosians. Some did not think he was divine in any sense. Others believe he was made divine after his resurrection. And this is right. And this is probably the one group that me and Ermin would be in agreement about. Going on the sources that we have, even Theodotus himself cannot be properly called an adoptionist. Theodotus thought he was a mere man, probably a prophet who received Christ or the Spirit at his baptism. And according to Hippolytus, our earlier source in him, he never claimed Jesus was divine in any sense. He saw Jesus exclusively as a Spirit-empowered prophet, as nothing more. But among this wider network of Theodosians, there were a mixture of beliefs which brought together views of Jesus as a mere man, a possession Christology like what the Ebionites have. Some had some strange speculations or combining Jesus with the figure of Melchizedek, but it was one particular chapter of these Theodosians who held that Jesus was deified after his resurrection, and that's when they say he becomes the Son of God. And it's that one chapter within the Theodosian movement who I think are the first true, authentic, bona fide adoptionists as far as we can actually trace it. And in my mind, that settles how, when, and who first saw Jesus as a human being adopted to divine sonship. It was one chapter of the Theodosians in Rome in the 190s or maybe the early 200s. Now, let me add to that. That is not to say there may have been other people who thought similarly. We just don't have the evidence for it. And some of the main texts trying to proof text that view, or maybe not proof text is not the right word, the standard text trotted out to try establish that adoptionist Christology was earlier. I just don't see it. So let me sum up then what I've argued. Okay, I don't think adoptionist Christology is exhibited in Romans 1:3-4. I think we have is a transformation of sonship from being maybe just a purely Davidic quality, then into a majestic or regal sense, but it's like going from one type of divine sonship to another. The Gospel of Mark, again, depending on your background, could be read in an adoptionistic way, but I think there's enough tales or signs within the narrative to show that Mark is not intending it to be read that way. I don't even think the Ebionites were really all that, well, certainly not actual adoptionists themselves. They seem to have held more of this possession Christology, at least as our sources describe them. Not even Theodotus in Rome was a real adoptionist. It was one chapter of the Theodosians who were the worst who are the first real full throttle opponents of adoptionist Christology in the 190s, which would mean that adoptionism was certainly not the first Christology. It emerged much later, and I suspect it emerged much later when people are wrestling with the question of how can you have Jesus as divine if there's only one God? That's one problem. But also, if God's nature is immutable and impassible, God cannot change and God does not suffer, then you need another option. Okay, so you've either got to go the docetic option to say, well, he doesn't have real humanity, or you've got to find some way to separate the divine bit from the human bit, or you can say, well, there was a human bit that then changes into the divine bit, and that's one way of getting around the problem of God's immutability and God's impassibility when it comes to adoptionism. I would say there was probably also good reason why adoptionism was rejected as an inadequate account of Jesus. Besides its general incongruity with, I think, the general witness of the New Testament and its lack of attestation in the earliest church fathers, you could argue that there's a theological reason. Adoptionist ultimately includes the view that one can be self-justified before God, and you could argue from a theological perspective, it is at odds with the gospel of grace. One Latin American scholar, or should say, one particular prominent church historian, Justo Gonzalez, argues that modern adoptionism denies the embodiment and efficacy of grace in Jesus Christ in favor of the view that Jesus merited divine favor by his good works. Jesus becomes the paragon of virtue who is rewarded with divine honors. Viewed this way, Gonzalez says, adoptionism is the counterpart to the American myth that everybody has a chance to make it on the back of their own hard work and on the steam of their own effort. Gonzalez writes, and he's referring here to the sort of Hispanic communities he's addressing. He says, Jesus Christ must be more than first among the redeemed, more than local boy who makes good. He must also be the Redeemer, the power from outside who breaks into our closed reality and breaks its structures of oppression. He must be more than the adopted Son of God. He must be God adopting us as sons and daughters. And there, us we Anglicans like to say, there doth end the lesson. So that is my, in short, my summary of how Jesus got adopted and when adopted Christology emerged.